Today's daf is daf lamed tes, and we're going to begin with Mokom Shenagu Lichfol. You'll see that about, I would say, 7 lines down from the top of the Yomi. And now we're talking about Hallel. And there's a kapitel in Tehillim, which is Kuf Yud Ches. And there's machlokas that we're going to learn in this brisa that the Gemara quotes here as to which psukim in that kapitel should be repeated. So we have Tana Rebbe. So we begin today's daf with the Shita of Rebbe. Rebbe says, Ofel Bad Dvarim, which means the following, that towards the end of our Hallel, you may remember Ana Hashem Hoshiana. Remember that?
Yeah.
So just for your knowledge, that is the 25th verse in Kapitel Kuf Yud Ches in Tehillim, 25. And then from there, we repeat, according to Rebbe, verse 25, verse 26, verse 27, verse 28, a whole slew of psukim. That's called kofel, and we repeat it. So we'll say Hodul Hashem Ki Tov, or Odeka Elkai Odeka. However, Rabbi Elazar ben Prata, Mosif Badvarim, he wants to begin doubling over the psukim earlier. So instead of beginning in Kapitli Kuf Yud Ches with Pasuk Chaf Hey, he begins earlier in Pasuk Chaf Aleph. My Mosif, Amrabai Mosif Lichpol May Odcha Kiani Son. So he takes us a full 4 psukim earlier, Ulamata, and then you continue from verse 21 all the way down to verse 29, 21 to 29, and each one of those verses is going to be repeated. And in fact, that's our minimum. We actually reflect the Shita of Rabbi Elazar against Rebbe. Now the Mishnah goes ahead and says there's another issue in bracha with regard to Hallel that depends upon minhag. And Mokum Shenogu Levarech Yevarech, which implies that there are those who don't have the minhag to recite a bracha. Amar Abaye says, wait a minute, what bracha are you talking about? There are 2 brachas. There's one bracha which introduces Hallel, Asher Kitshanu Mitzalsav Tzibanu, either Lekroas HaHallel or Al HaHallel, the many different nuschos, Ashkenazim, Sfaradim, but anyway, that's the first bracha. Then there's a bracha Lachreha that closes Hallel. And that starts with Yahalucha and it ends with Baruch Atah Hashem Melech Mulo Batishbachos. Amar Abai Lo Shanu. And the Mishnah says that whether you make the bracha or not depends upon the particular minhag of that location. That was only applicable eloli achad. As far as the bracha in the paragraph that was attached to Hallel at the end of Hallel, which begins with Yahalucha Hashem Elokeinu and ends with Baruch Atah Hashem Melech Mulo Batishbachos Avalafanav. But as far as bracha asher kitshanu mitzvos tzivanu lekros hallel mitzvah levarich, which means sachova, it's an absolute obligation. It doesn't depend upon which location or what minhag you have, and that's because the first bracha, the opening bracha, is radically different than the closing bracha. The opening bracha is a birchas hamitzvah, whereas the closing bracha is a birchas shevach v'hodoya. And with regard to shevach v'hodoya, we find very often that it depends upon minhag. Some have the minhag for that bracha of Shevach Odah, some don't. But as far as Birchas HaMitzvah is concerned, that's an absolute requirement. The Omer of Yehuda Meshmuel, Kol HaMitzvahs Kulon Mevarech Aleim Over Lasiyos. There are 2 statements here that Rabbi Yehuda is making in the name of Shmuel. One is that every mitzvah generates a chiyuv bracha. There's no such thing as a mitzvah without a bracha. And number 2, the bracha should be recited over la'asiyasim, immediately before, but contiguous to the asiyah. And since this is an absolute requirement, it cannot depend upon the locale and what the local custom is. And therefore, Abai says that when the Mishnah says, Makom shenagu levarech yivarech, it's referring specifically and exclusively to the bracha shel Yaakov, the closing bracha. Now the Gemara is focused on the words of Shmuel. Shmuel says, over l'asiyos, which means before the asiyah. My mashma, where did Shmuel, from whence did he derive the high, quote unquote, over, the word over, lishna, it's a language of the ikdumehu, that it should come before. Over usually means to pass over, but how do you know it means to come before? And the Gemara offers three answers to this question. Each one of the Amoraim of these three, respectively, give his own source in the Torah to prove that the word over in biblical Hebrew means before. We'll start with Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak the Siv. He invokes a pasuk in Shmuel Beis, Vayoratz Achimoatz derech hakikar vayavores hakuch. What happens is that after Avshalom, who was David HaMelech's son, and he rebelled against his father, when he died, it was critical to send the message to David. And there was a fast runner by the name of Kushi, or maybe Kushi means he came from Ethiopia. He had won the Olympics that year as the fastest runner. But then there was someone named Achimatz. He was even faster than the Kushi. And it says, Vayoratz Achimatz derech hakikar vayavores hakushi. Vayavores hakushi means that he came to David HaMelech before the Kushi. So he was there before, and therefore the word over, or vayavor as it's conjugated as a verb, indicates before, akdumi. I have a different source. When Yaakov Avinu went out to greet Esau, on his way back from Choram, he splits his family into two camps, l'shnei machnos. And then the pasuk records, "V'hu avar lifneim," that after dividing up his family, then he, Yaakov Avinu, went in front of them to greet Esau first. Ibai Semen, the third possibility, mehacha, and this is a stum of the Gemara. The Gemara doesn't attach this to any particular Amora. And we're going to derive it from a pasuk in Micha. The Navi Micha foresees or foretells in a prophetic vision the time of the ultimate redemption. Vayavar Malkam lifneihem v'Hashem b'rosham. Malkam, the king of Israel, is an allusion to Melech HaMashiach, and he's going to go in front of them and take the people of Israel into Eretz Yisrael when they come back from the Golus. And Hashem and God will go in front of the Mashiach. But in any event, Vayavar lifneim, the word Vayavar means that he, the Melech, comes before. I have an interesting footnote here about why each of the Amoraim was a little bit hesitant vis-a-vis the other derivations. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak and also the Bois Ema, they didn't quote Abaye's pasuk. Why? Because in the case of Abaye, we can interpret, second, Af pasuk zeh. Right, so the question is, why didn't they bring Abaye's pasuk? And he gives the answer that Abaye says, Vayavars hakushi, right? He came before the kushi. They interpreted that he came way before the kushi. Ikdimo harbe. And that's not going to be a sufficient source for us, because we want to interpret the word over to mean immediately before, samach l'mitzvah, so that a person should not recite a bracha, then take off his clothes and go into the mikveh. He should go into the mikveh, cover his body with the water, and make the bracha, and then dunk his hand into the mikveh. That's called over lasiyos. Samach l'mitzvah. And then he asks the question, why is it that the other shitos, that's Abaye and the Ikad Amre, why did they reject the limud from Yaakov Avinu? And they said that Yaakov, it would seem that Yaakov of our Lifneim also might mean that he went way before them. It's not summer. But the advantage of the last pasuk is that Derech HaMelech Loleches B'Rosh HaChel V'chol Ha'am Holchim Achrav B'Samuch Mamash. When the king goes out in front of the nation is immediately on his footsteps, on his heels. So that gives you the concept of summer. Now, this Tosfos is a fascinating Tosfos, Dibra Maskell over Lasios. And just to give you a little bit of a gist of what this Tosfos is about, if we had an hour, it would be a wonderful discussion. Tosfos is bothered by a certain Gemara later on that says, with regard to lulav, Hadba'asam zui mitzvasam, mida'agbe nofikbe. As soon as you lift up the Daled Minim, you fulfill your mitzvah. So Tosfos wants to know, when do you recite the bracha on the Daled Minim? He feels that if the Daled Minim are munach b'shulchan, then it's not samuch lemitzvah, because he's going to recite the bracha, like the guy who hasn't taken his clothes off yet before he goes into the mikvah. And then he's going to pick up the Daled Minim. It's over. It's one step removed. So how do you solve the problem? Because if you're going to say make the bracha after you take the Daled Minim into your hands, then immediately you've already fulfilled the mitzvah. And over Las Yosim requires that the bracha be recited before the mitzvah. Mm-hmm. And Tosfos offers a number of answers. We'll just mention a few of them. One answer is, Tosfos says, let him take the Daled Minim, but one of the four Minim, he takes Shalom Kederach Dilos. So he turns it upside down. Let's say he turns the esrog upside down, not the way it normally grows. And then he recites the bracha, and then all he has to do now to fulfill the mitzvah is turn the esrog right side up. Another answer Tosfos says, which is a fascinating answer, is that even if he takes the four minim into his hands, he still has a part of the mitzvah that he hasn't fulfilled. Which part is that? Nanuim. So it'll be over Las Yasim because of Nanuim. And my Rebbe Rav Soloveitchik Yisrael is proof of this Tosfos that Nanuim is an integral part of the mitzvah of lulav. It's not just a separate, independent kiyum, because then it would not be over Las Yasim. Now, Rav Osa, we start the main topic for today's daf. And you can't blame me, I didn't write the script. It's Shvius. So we're now going into Shvius, actually. We're already in the period of Tosefet Shvius, because El is Tosefet Shvius. And of course, as you know, we have a 7-year cycle, and every 7th year is Shvius. And our sugya is going to focus on the concept called Kedushas Peiros Shvius, the sanctity of the fruits of Shvius. Now, this particular Sukkah that in Ritz Hashem is fast and approaching could be a problem. And I'll tell you why. It's possible that although the Lovim that they're going to be selling this year are Shishis up on the 6th year, the Esrogim might be from Shvius. Even though you'll ask me, there's only a very short period of time between the beginning of Shvius, let's say Rosh Hashanah and Sukkot, 15 days. Can you actually grow an esrog in 15 days? But nevertheless, as we'll soon see, esrog has a special halacha. It's a unique category because of the way it grows, rainwater, irrigation, so forth and so on, in the context of Shvius. Now, if you're going to assume either this year's esrog or perhaps next year's esrog is going to be an esrog of Shvius, then the halacha is, the Torah tells us that Peiros Shvius require achila. The mitzvah is achila. We'll soon see that we're going to expand our definition of achila to include hana in certain cases, other kinds of usages of a fruit. But li'achla, the Gemara derives v'lo l'schora, that Peiros Shvius are not used because of their sanctity for business deals. Now, someone is selling you an esrog. Presumably, he's going to be making a profit on that sale. How then can you pay him for the esrog? And if you pay him for the esrog, then you're violating lifnei evil osite michshol. You're putting a michshol in front of him because he, the seller, is violating the isur of li'achlo v'lo l'schora. So the Mishnah therefore says, "Alokeach lulav bi chavero." If you take a look at Rashi, about 7 lines down from the top, li nirad alokeach lulav me ama oretz garsinon. you should take out the word mechavero and substitute am ha'aretz. Now, the reason for that is because a chaver is not just a friend or a colleague, but in a context of observing the law, the word chaver means someone who's meticulous about observing the law. If the seller were to be a chaver, then you'd have no problem. Why? Because you would be absolutely sure that the monies that you pay him, which are called demei shvius. Okay, let me just backtrack one moment. Shvius is not only a sanctification of the fruits, but shvius is tofes damin. Again, if you have a little notebook, you'd write down tofes damin. If we ever find a marker, we'll write it here. Oh, there is a marker. Look at that. For shvius, Kiddusha shvius is tofes damin. So I'm just giving you a heads up. We'll have a lot to talk about. But tofes damin means that if you're holding on to shvius, payros that have Kiddush shvius, and I buy them for you, the money that you get now is sanctified because shvius is tofes damin. So the question is what's the seller going to do with that money that I gave him to buy his esrog? And we're worried that he may use it in a way that's not proper, which means that money has to be used to buy food that could be eaten within the time period for shvius, and the time period for the mitzvah of achila shvius is up until what's called shas habiur. Okay, that's another concept. I'm telling you, Rabbi, we're going to get a little mini. This is 2 block Gemara, so today and tomorrow, a little summary of Masechet shvius. There's something called li'achla v'lo l'schora. That's another concept like to know here. Lo l'schora, okay, not for business deals. And then there's something called shas habiur. And this is a very complicated concept, but basically it means that at a certain point in the agricultural season, that particular species, and it changes from one species to the other, ceases to be found. It's already been consumed by the animals or by the people who harvest it. And after Shas Habir, there's a special mitzvah to take any shvius or money that was sanctified with Kedusha shvius and to get rid of it. That's called bir, to destroy it. All right, again, these are all concepts that will be in Rishon Shem studying. So the man is buying a lulav, and it's shvius. No say lo esrog v'matan. Lefisha ein rashoy l'loch. So let's start backwards. Ein rashoy l'loch means you're not allowed to buy from an Amoritz. Rashi substitutes Amoritz here for the Girsa because we're talking about someone who is not necessarily reliable on the meticulous observance of the laws of Shvius. And therefore, if you buy the esrog from him, he might be making a profit, and he's doing it with schora. And not only that, he might take the money that he got, which has sanctified through Tvisas Dov and Kedusha Shvius, and he might use it for his own purposes, or leave it in a bank after Shas Habir, and that he's not allowed to do. However, notice that the Mishnah is only concerned with what? With the esrog, not with the lulav. That's going to be a big deal for us. Why is it that he's dealing with the esrog? So in any event, imagine you're a seller. Well, I don't want to call you an Amoritz, but let's say here's a seller, he's an Amoritz, and I come to him and I say to him, I'll pay you for the lulav, but I'm not going to pay you for the esrog. I want it as a gift. What's the guy going to say to me? In Yiddish, we say, "Pfeif dir an." Are you familiar with that? Go blow a whistle. You know? Yiddish phrase that I was raised on from my family. He's not going to want to give away an esrog. An esrog is an expensive item. So we're going to see later on that there's another concept here called havla. Okay? Havla. Havla means literally to swallow something up. And what you do is, you say to him, look, okay, what price do you want me to pay for the lulav? He says, 10. What price do you want me to pay for the esrog? 20. So I'm going to pay you 30, but I'm going to buy your lulav at 30. And you're going to give me the esrog b'maton. And then he has no problem with it. He ends up with the exact price that he wanted to get. Again, we have to ask the question, why isn't there an issue with the lulav and there's only an issue with the esrog? The simple answer would be, the Gemara is going to take a million miles till we get to that answer, is that lulav does not have kedusha shvius, because lulav is not edible, and only something that's la'achla and could be eaten is sanctified with kedusha shvius. But that's either tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. I don't know when we'll get to that. The Gemara asks the following question: Lo rotzo liten lo b'matanamam. You're telling me that I should approach the seller, and I should say to Mr. Seller, give me the esrog as a gift. He's not going to agree. Or Avuna mavlia le dmei esrog. As we said before, he'll give it to you as a gift by utilizing the method of havla, in which the amount of money that he's charging you for the esrog will be swallowed up into the price of the lulav. The Gemara asks for leisad le behedger. Why can't he buy the esrog? Why can he come into the seller and say to him, here, I want to buy your esrog. You're selling it to me for 20. Here's 20. I'm buying the esrog. And the Gemara answers, Lefisha ein mosrin t'mei peros shvius li'ama oretz. This is where Rashi derived his conclusion that we talked about in Amma Oretz, who's not careful about kedusha shvius. And therefore, when I give him these damim, this amount of money, he's going to be making a profit. He's not going to be using it for kedusha shvius, because again, as we said before, the damim, money that you pay him for shvius, is itself endowed with kedusha shvius. And therefore, you're violating the feiva lo sitei mechshel by setting up a situation in which he's going to violate the iser of kedushas shvius.
Isn't there an iser of buying it because it's Torah?
No, you're not buying it for the sake of schora. Schora is only also if you're buying it for the sake of schora. If you're buying it not for the sake of schora, you have no intention to sell it and make a profit, but rather to use it for your own purposes. In this case, for the mitzvah of ulakachtem lachem, you don't violate these. The seller, he's motivated. He's got his own set of values. I mean, he wants to make a profit. So that's a question of schora. Now, we're soon going to see that schora only applies if he's making a serious profit. And the question is going to be, how much of a profit is he making on the esrog? So that we'll get to soon. And we're going to have a problem because even if he's getting a very bare minimum profit on the esrog, it's irrelevant because we're worried about the dominant. Whatever monies that come into the seller's possession as a barter for the esrog, if he doesn't treat that money in the proper way, because the money is endowed with kedusha shvius, then again I've been machshel him and I violated l'fnei v'lo sitei mechshel.
All money or just profit?
We're going to assume it's all the money because all the money is now a barter for kedusha shvius. So that means that when you give a price tag to an esrog, we called it 20, we just pulled the number. So that 20 is now sanctified with kedusha shvius because it's replacing the esrog. It's got the status of tfisas damim, of dmei shvius. The Sanya and the Brisa says a mosrim dmei peros shvius lama oretz. We do not buy fruits from an ama oretz if those fruits are sanctified with kedusha shvius. So they grew during the 7th year, and now you're going to be buying his peros that is sanctified with kedusha shvius, and now he, the seller, is making a profit. However, yoser mimazon shalosh seudos. There's a minimum amount of a value less than there's no prohibition. What the Chachamim did was they tried to figure out under what circumstances is the money considered a very limited amount of money. The seller is bringing in less than a significant sum of money. And we'll see the shear of Shalosh Seudos in a second. And less than that shear, we have no problem. First of all, it's not really schora. I mean, he's not making much of a profit if it's such a minimum amount of funds. That's not the way you build a business. That's not a business enterprise. Secondly, we don't have to worry about what he's going to do with the dummy. Why? Because this minimum amount of dumim, of money, is equivalent to what it would take to buy 3 meals. So imagine it's Friday, you go out to the shuk, and you want to buy Suda Shabbos. How many Sudas do we eat on Shabbos? 3. So now, even though the rest of the week, by the way, at the time of the Gemara, they only ate 2 meals a day. But since on Friday, preparing for Shabbos, they would buy 3 meals. They set up the shear as 3 meals. Now, if 3 meals would cost X, let's put a number on it. Let's say 3 meals, 5 shekel a meal. You get a good deal on 3 meals. It's 15 shekel. And now you're selling the esrog for 20 shekel. So that's going to be a chashash. Now we're going to be worried that what is the seller going to do with this money? He just made 20 shekel on the sale of an esrog. That's above 3 seudos. We're not going to assume that he's going to come home with that money and he's going to buy on Friday 3 seudos for Shabbos. He's got a significant amount of money. He's got now 20 shekel. He's going to take that money and deposit it in his bank account, meaning he's not going to spend it immediately. And now what we're choshish is that since the damim, these monies have sanctification of shvius, which means that he's got to use the money for the mitzvah achila up until zman biur. Let's say, for example, zman biur. Again, as I said, it changes from one species to the other, and that's how you have to learn Masechet shvius, which is not part of Daf Yomi. But anyway, so it's about, let's say, Hanukkah time in many cases. So that's called Kol L'Chayev Min HaSod, right? So there are no more animals that are out there in the field trying to find that particular species. So at that point, it's called Shskar View, and the Torah commands you at that moment in time to take all the shvius of that species and take it out of your house. You're not allowed to keep it in your house. And what we're afraid of is that when the seller makes a profit of more than Mazon Shalosh or below, that we're not worried about. He's going to spend it immediately within the near future. But once you give him a significant sum, then if it's royal and Mazon Shalosh Sudos, and only Shalosh Sudos, then he tiru chacham. That's called Kidei Chayav. That's the amount that the mocher needs for his living expenses on a daily basis. I'm reading the Hebrew here. Mashet Tzorach Liknos Mazon Lisudos Shel Yom Echad. And since on Erev Shabbos he's going to buy Shalosh Sudas, that's called 3 Sudas for food for one day. But above and beyond that, the assumption is that the esrog is worth more than Mazon Shalosh Sudas. It's dam of Yikarim, and it's more than the shear of Mazon Shalosh Sudas. And now you're going to be giving him that significant amount of funds, and we're afraid that he's going to put it away in his bank account. And months down the line, he'll use that money as a business investment, and it's after Shskar View, and he has violated Kedusha Shvius. Now, what happens if a chaver, as we said, a chaver means a reliable, observant Jew who's very meticulous about the laws of Shvius, he accidentally purchased payros of Shvius? Is there anything that he can do to salvage the situation? And the Bryce establishes ve'im masar, which means he forgot, and he gave over to made payros Shvius beyond Shalosh Shlos to an Amoritz. Then he should take fruits in his own house. I'm talking about the buyer who's a chaver. The Yomi, and he should declare haremos halol, the monies that I gave to this Hamaretz, which are endowed with Kedusha Shvius, Yehu mechulolim al peiros sheyesh li b'toch beis. I want to now do a redemption process, a pidyon, or otherwise known in the Gemara's language as a chilul, in which I remove the sanctity from the monies that I gave to pay the seller, who's an Amoritz, and I want to transfer the Kedusha of Shvius from the monies onto my parents. And now the ball is in my court, so to speak, and now the Chaver will observe the laws of Kedushas Shvius. What do you say?
Great. No.
Again, these are Doraisa, by the way. It's not really tricks. I mean, it's the recommendation. You could call it tricks. You're in a tight situation. You forgot. You paid him the money, and now what's going to happen? The money's going to go into his bank account. He's going to use it months down the line, way past Shasabir for business purposes. So you now want to save him an Avera, and in effect save yourself an Avera because you're going to violate Lifnei, you're responsible. So what do? You do a chil.
The seller doesn't even know what you're doing. I'm just doing it.
He doesn't have to know it.
I'm putting on my heroes and goes off.
If he becomes a Baal Tshuva, so to speak, and he really wants to be meticulous, and now he's got domin that he knows he received as payment for shpias, then he has two choices. Either he could be machmir and use it for food purposes up until Shasabir, or he can pick up a phone and call the buyer if he has his phone number, if he has a record, and say to him, look, what should I do? I realize now I'm an Amoritz, but I became a Talmud Chacham, I became a Chaver. What should I do? He'll say to him, don't worry about it. I already solved your problem. Your most that you only want to do not have Kedushas.